Hey everybody, Mr. Klein here again with the cause of the Civil War. This is part 2 of 3. We're going to be looking through the main causes of the Civil War, the events that led up to the division between the United States and the Confederate States of America, what happened there, all those kind of things. So if you've not watched part 1, make sure you go back and watch part 1 before you watch this one. And so we're going to jump right into it, kind of talk about what was going on. So just a quick recap. We talked about in the first part, we talked about the Missouri Compromise. We talked about the Compromise of 1850. We talked about the Fugitive Slave Act, and we talked about Uncle Tom's Cabin. All these things create a big divide between the North and South, makes Northerners be more aware of slavery going on, and so we're going to see what starts happening in these states. Remember, there's something before we get into the rest of these that we need to talk about. We talked about in part 1, but we need a refresher on this. The key issue is slavery here. A lot of people like to shift the gears and think about, it's a states' rights issue, those kind of things, that is true that it does have states' rights issues, but it's state rights issues whether or not they can decide if they're going to have slavery or be free. And so this idea of popular sovereignty pops up again. We talk about the principles of the Constitution, letting the people decide whether or not things are going to happen in that territory that we have. So this idea of popular sovereignty becomes a big sticking point for a lot of things. We see a lot of bloodshed are happening in this part of the events leading up to the Civil War, and we'll kind of go from there. All right, so let's get into our first one here. So once again, popular sovereignty leads to bloodshed. There we go. Who would have thought that's what we're about to talk about? And so the first thing we're going to talk about is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So we've had a couple compromises. We had the Missouri Compromise that said that there's a 3630 line, the southern border of Missouri, saying anything north of that border would be a free state, anything below that border would be a slave state. So they go with that for a little bit. But then we get to the issue of the state of California. California wants to be admitted as a free state, but that goes against the Missouri Compromise line because it goes right through the middle of California. So they create the Compromise of 1850. So they go away from that line and they decide that California is going to enter as a free state. Then you have the territories of Utah and New Mexico. And they decide they want to let the people decide that through popular sovereignty, if they're going to be a free territory or a slave territory that eventually become free and slave states. Remember, all this is about balance within the federal government, right? So the balance of power, who gets the votes on certain things. So if you have more slave states, there's going to be more pro-slavery laws. If you have more free states, you're going to have more abolitionist laws, so banning slavery, those kind of things there. So now we get to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So we have 2 new territories that we need to talk about. And so we divide lands in the Kansas and Nebraska territories. So we have these territories already. These are the territories that are part of the Louisiana Purchase. They are first part of Missouri territory. Once Missouri became a state, it broke away, becomes Kansas and Nebraska territories. So the first thing is that divides the lands in Kansas and Nebraska. So we're dividing up what the borders of these territories are going to be. This is where that idea of popular sovereignty comes in again. So slavery in these territories are determined by popular sovereignty. Okay, so remember, what that means is that the people that live in that territory decide whether or not they're going to be a free territory or a slave territory. They say they do not want the federal government to decide those things. So a lot of people in the federal government that made these laws say, let the people decide. It shouldn't be a federal issue there. The main person that kind of pushes this popular sovereignty debate is the guy that you see on the screen. His name is Stephen A. Douglas. We're going to talk about him again because he's pretty important when he has a debate with Abraham Lincoln. We'll kind of talk about what happens there. The problem in Kansas and Nebraska territories is that you had a coming together of people that were pro-slavery and people that were against slavery. Your abolitionists is what they're called. So you had this heated debate going on there between these two groups. So they tried to decide that, should there be a free state or a slave territory? I keep saying state, I mean territory. Sorry. Northerners believe that this act completely gets rid of the Missouri Compromise, that line that was created that says anything north of that 3613 line would be a free state. Both territories of Kansas and Nebraska are above that line, with Kansas and Nebraska, and Kansas being right next to Missouri, and then you have Nebraska right above that as well. So that's above the southern border of Missouri. So they say this shouldn't do that. This repeals the Compromise of 1820. So what happens is that you have these two people battling, and they actually start fighting and start killing each other. So you actually have people killing each other over this decision of whether or not they want their territory to be free or slave. So that's a big thing to remember there. And that kind of leads us into our next thing, which is what we call the Civil War before the Civil War. The reason why we call it that is because we talk about this thing going on in the Kansas-Nebraska territories. You literally have a mini civil war happening in these territories. So we're going to talk about the Pottawatomie Massacre and Bleeding Kansas. These all the compromise of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, leads into Bleeding Kansas and the Pottawatomie Massacre. And so that's why we kind of put these two together, kind of show what is going on there. So the guy you see below me and the picture of him that looks like the most glorious photo of all time. This guy just, whoa, with tornadoes behind him and fire. Okay, this guy's going to play a big role throughout the Civil War, leading up to it. We'll talk about who he is. His name, John Brown. So make sure you know that name. Make sure you know who he is. He is from New England. He is an abolitionist, which means he believes in getting rid of slavery. He's also known as, some people call him as the first terrorist in the United States. Domestic terrorist, because he fights violence with violence. That's his idea. He's not into this whole, let's go work it out in the government, let's go talk about these things. No, if you're going to be mean, we're going to be mean back. And he does some pretty crazy things. And this is the first one that he does, which is the Pottawatomie Massacre, which happens in May of 1856. So this happens a little over 2 years after the Kansas-Nebraska Act takes effect. So what was the Pottawatomie Massacre? So what happens is that John Brown and his men literally go into this territory and drag 5 pro-slavery men out of their houses and kill them using swords. Like, it's a very violent act, right? Not something that gives you any kind of like slow or quick death. It's literally, I'm dragging you out of the house, I'm going to kill you with a sword. And so that's his idea of, I'm going to fight violence with violence, right? You're not going to do, if you're going to hold these people as slaves, we're going to treat you that way as well, right? So that's kind of his big thing. His big thing is that he was told by God that he was to kill these men and drag them out of their houses and things like that. So he's using the power of religion to kind of justify his killing of these people. Because of John Brown and the Pottawatomie Massacre, that leads us to this idea of Bleeding Kansas. So this is where we have the Civil War before the Civil War. So these pro-slavery people and these anti-slavery people that lived in this territory of Kansas start fighting between each other because they are upset about Kansas trying to become a pro-slavery territory. So you had these people fighting each other. And we call it Bleeding Kansas because 200 people were killed before order was restored in September 1856. So this is a pretty big event that happens. You can see that people are very heated about slavery. Some people want it, some people do not. And it's starting to lead to bloodshed now. And that's something that is going to be a bigger problem as we get down the line, further down to almost to the start of the Civil War here. But John Brown, with him coming from New England to the Kansas territory, really pours gasoline on the fire by killing these men and declaring that God told him to do those kind of things there. So we're starting to see this fighting happening over these laws. And it's a pretty big deal there. Okay, so you can kind of see here, this is a really cool map to look at when we look at how slavery starts to um, like starts to form here. So you see the map that's right below my little circle bubble here is the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So you can see where we have that slavery is permitted. That's the green. Orange is slavery is prohibited, means it's not allowed. And then the kind of tannish yellow is where they say decision is left up to the territory. So this is a really, really good map to kind of pause and look at to understand how things are changing due to this idea of popular sovereignty. So remember, the Missouri Compromise, you had Missouri as a slave state, you had Maine as a free state that keeps the balance there, and then you create that 3630 line that says anything below that line will be free, anything below that line will be a slave state, right? And so that's, you can kind of see it there. Then we go 30 years into the future, get to the Compromise of 1850, and you can see on that map right there, a lot of things have changed. For the most part, the land is the 3630 line was being used, but the problem is that you have California now being admitted as a free state, so that's why you see it's orange there. Okay, I'll use my little mouse here so you can see where it's orange. So that goes against the 3630 line, so it's right in the middle of it. But then you have, remember, the territories of Utah and New Mexico. So if you have not watched part one, make sure you watch part one. We'll go a little bit more detail on that, but Utah and New Mexico, these territories are decided based on popular sovereignty. So allowing popular sovereignty to determine that. So the people that live there get determined they're going to be a free territory or a slave territory. So a lot of people already thought that the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, was already taken away because of the Compromise of 1850, because Utah is definitely above that line there, right? And so that's a big thing there. And then we get to what we just talked about that led to the Potawatomi Massacre and Bleeding Kansas, which is the Kansas-Nebraska Act that happened 4 years later in 1844. So you can see you have this huge swath of territory in Kansas and Nebraska, which during the Missouri Compromise stated that it would be a free territory, is now being determined by popular sovereignty. So the people are the ones deciding that. So you can see why a lot of abolitionists were upset with the Kansas and Nebraska Act, because look right there, now all this territory that was technically going to be free territory can now, if enough people live there that want to be pro-slavery, can be a slave territory. And so that's a big thing that's happening during this time that really upsets a lot of the Northerners. Is now the balance could tip over to the pro-slavery areas a lot faster there. The Southern states, I think that's a good idea, because they're saying, hey, it should be the state's decisions or the people's decisions to whether or not they want to be pro-slavery, and they think that there'd be more people that are pro-slavery, so those territories would become slave territories, which means once they eventually become states, they would be slave states, and now the balance tips in favor of representation with slavery instead of free. And so this is a really, really good couple of maps to show you the difference in the progress that we had going to the West and having all these new territories and determining if slavery would be allowed or not. All right, our next thing that we're going to talk about is Dred Scott. Dred Scott is a very interesting case to look at. So this is a Supreme Court case that happens in 1857. So we're getting a little bit closer to the Civil War. The Kansas-Nebraska Act happens in 1854. Bleeding Kansas and the Potawatomi Massacre happens in 1856. So it's a little bit after those. So this is a really, really important case because Dred Scott is somebody that was suing for his freedom. So the story behind him is that he was a slave in the Southern Territories, and his owner took him to the North where there was no slavery. And so he lived there for quite some time, and his owner dies. He gets taken somewhere else, goes down to the South there. So his owner goes back into the South, into a slave state, and dies. So what Dred Scott says is that because he lived in free territory for such a long time, that he should be a free man. So he should not have to worry about being a slave anymore. So this court case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court decides to rule against Dred Scott. So Dred Scott is the African American, so the guy that's right below me there. So the Supreme Court says, nope, we're not doing that. So their decision, the reason why, is they say that he is not a citizen, therefore he cannot sue anybody. All right, so he could not sue for his freedom. So they're technically still saying that Dred Scott is property. Okay, so a lot of these people at this time still thought as African Americans as being property. So he did not have any rights. All right, sorry for that awkward stop. There's a bell. So they say that Dred Scott cannot sue because he did not have rights as a citizen. He was still considered property at this time. So he did not have the rights that we have in the Constitution. And so his court case was pretty much like, it doesn't matter because you don't have that chance to do those things. The other thing that comes out of this case, okay, so one thing is that they're saying that African Americans do not have the right to sue because they're not a citizen. So that's one thing. The other big thing is that Congress could not ban slavery in any territories. So that goes into that whole idea of that it's up to the people that live in those territories to decide whether or not this is going to be a free territory or a slave territory. It cannot be the federal government that does that. That is a gigantic piece of the puzzle when it comes to people being very upset with what's going on. It seemed that with the Missouri Compromise that you're going to have more free states than you did slave states. And then the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Compromise of 1850 kind of throw that out the window. And now you have all this extra territory that can now be a slave state or slave territory. So that's a big part of this case. Not only that African Americans don't have rights as citizens, they're not citizens at all, but now Congress cannot ban slavery in any territories, saying that it has to be a decision made by the people that live there. This also officially repeals the Missouri Compromise, right? So in the Missouri Compromise, that 3630 line, anything north was being banned from having slavery. And so that ruling right there, that Part B on number 4, gets rid of the Missouri Compromise. So now the Missouri Compromise is completely gone, right? So repeal means remove there. So that's a big case that happens. It really puts a big dent into the abolitionist movement of getting African Americans their freedom and rights as a citizen. And so that's a really big thing to think about. And now Congress cannot ban slavery in any territories. It has to be up to the territories to decide that there. Okay? Like I said, now slavery can exist in the northern territories, which will change the balance between slavery and free states eventually when they become states. And so people are very, very worried about slavery becoming an even bigger institution in the United States. All right. One more thing we're going to talk about, and when we talk about cause of the Civil War, this is the start of one of the reasons why you see the southern states finally secede or leave the United States is because this man right here, Abraham Lincoln. And the reason why we talk about him here is because him, and if you remember, we talked about Stephen Douglas when we talked about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. These guys have a debate between each other. And these debates are pretty important because this is showing the a new political party that has just kind of started themselves out. So if you know a little bit about political parties, we start out with Federalists and Democratic Republicans, right? And eventually the Federalists lose favor, they lose power. The Democratic Republicans drop the Republican name, they become the Democrats. Then you have this party called the Whig Party, which has some power for a little bit, but then they lose a little bit of power. And then you have these kind of abolitionist movement, along with the Whigs, kind of come together and form a new political party called the Republican Party. So now you have Republicans, the Republican Party, and the Democratic Party. These parties are the ones that we kind of see today. Now, here's the difference, okay? Is that the Republicans, we have a flip-flop here. During this time, Republicans are not, it's the same political party, but we have different systems kind of in place to kind of see a change later on, where the Republican Party was the more liberal party at that time, and the Democratic Party was the more conservative party at that time. Nowadays, it's flip-flop, right? The Republican Party is the more conservative party, and the Democratic Party is the more liberal party that we have there. So we have this rise of this new political party called the Republicans happening. Abraham Lincoln is one of those young political, had aspirations to be a politician, and he runs for U.S. Senate. And so we have this debate between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, who is the incumbent, or the one that's in power at this time. Remember, Stephen A. Douglas was a big proponent of popular sovereignty. He believed it should be up to the people that live there that decide whether or not they're going to be a free territory or a slave territory. Lincoln believed he did not agree with the idea of slavery being spread across the United States. He said that all U.S. citizens, that includes African Americans, were entitled to all the national rights. So those rights that are written in the Constitution, everyone that lives here should have those rights. And it's because slavery makes African Americans property, that slavery should not spread, and it would be bad for the United States. Douglas debated against Lincoln, and he says that Republicans, all they want to do is make all the states free states, which he says is against the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott case, right? It should be popular sovereignty that decides these things. And Douglas actually says this in the debate, this quote right here, that that if Lincoln's trying to make every state a free state, that it would lead to warfare between the North and South. And so this idea, this whole thing that Lincoln's debating Douglas about, will come back up when Lincoln runs for president and becomes president, because he doesn't want slavery to spread any further. And so this debate puts that in people's head that if Lincoln becomes any kind of power, that he's going to stop slavery from happening. And they're right. And Douglas actually foresaw the future here, that with Lincoln, Republicans being in power, that there'd be war between them. Crazy thing, Douglas actually wins the Senate seats because he says that popular sovereignty should be the deciding factor for slavery, not Congress or the Supreme Court. So his big thing is that the government should be as hands-off as much as possible, and it should be the people that want to decide what those things are, and the people that live in these areas agree with him, right? They want their voice heard, not the government telling them what to do. And so that's something that really helps Douglas gain a lot of popularity and win the Senate seat over Lincoln. So Lincoln actually loses his U.S. Senate seat. But this is not the last time that we will see Lincoln as we go through. But this debate is really important because this is the first time we see the Republican Party really start to gain a lot of power and start to show their kind of platform of what they believe in. And so that's why we kind of focus on that as we go through. So that is part two. So we went through the Kansas-Nebraska Act, how that changed the idea of the Missouri Compromise being taken away, allowing the Kansas and Nebraska territories to decide whether or not they want to be a free territory, slave territory, based on popular sovereignty. So there's that word again. Like I said, we're going to talk a lot about that all through here. That eventually leads to John Brown, who's a crazy, violent dude, and decides to go to the Kansas territory, and with the Potawatomi massacre, kills 5 people, drags them out of their house that were pro-slavery, kills them with swords, and then this leads to Plating, Kansas, where we have this mini civil war between pro-slavery and anti-slavery people. 200 people die because of that. Eventually, they restore order, all those kind of things. Then we have the Dred Scott case, which is really important because this decides that one, that African Americans are not citizens, therefore they cannot sue anybody, so they're still considered property at this time, and that Congress could not ban slavery in any territories, which officially repeals the Missouri Compromise. So that's a pretty big court case that happens there. And then eventually we have the Lincoln Douglas debates, where we see the rise of the Republican Party and their idea that slavery should not spread, that all U.S. citizens and African Americans should have the same national rights, which is those first 10 amendments that we have in the Constitution. Douglas just says, no, this will, if he becomes Republicans in power, this is going to start a war between the North and the South, which he's technically true, because that's why we're talking about causes of the Civil War. And then Douglas actually wins the seat because this idea that popular sovereignty, that people should decide, not the government. So there you have it. So there's part 2. So make sure, if you haven't watched part 1, make sure you watch part 1, and then after this, make sure you head on to part 3. All right, I'll see y'all later.